Welcome to the Creative Writing Career Podcast, where you learn how to make writing more than a hobby, make it a career. And here are your hosts, Stephan Bugai, Justin Sloan, and Kevin Tumlinson.
Hello, everyone. This is the Creative Writing Career Podcast, and I'm Justin Sloan, and along with me are my co-hosts, Stephan Bugai and Kevin Tumlinson. And today we're going to be talking about video games and story in games. It's a pretty exciting topic. And first off, how you guys doing, co-hosts?
I'm all good.
I'm doing well.
I'm excited about our topic. I actually don't have a background in this one, so I'm going to add what I have read and what I know, but I may not be much use to you guys in this one.
And you have played games, though, right?
I have played games, so yeah.
Awesome.
Wouldn't
That's all
call
we need
myself
from you
much
today.
of a gamer these days, but yeah, I have played games.
You can moderate us a bit then. And my background in this is that, I work for Telltale Games where, as I've said in my introduction, written on some games as Game of Thrones, Walking Dead Michonne, Tales from the Borderland, a little bit of Minecraft story mode. And I've been involved in little other side projects that haven't produced anything yet, such as a small similar game and projects that are, related, such as interactive fiction, whatnot, that are in the works. And Stephan, how about you?
Well, I was also at Telltale Games and worked on Walking Dead Season 2, Wolf Among Us, Game of Thrones, and Tales from the Borderlands. I also recently co-wrote a story for a mobile game for a company called Penny Pop that should be out any day now, in theory.
Awesome.
And prior to that, many, many moons ago, I was a contractor at Strategic Simulations and worked on Silent Hunter and Thunderscape, and also designed a game for a long defunct company called Gravity, and the name of the game was Bug. So I've done both like heavily story driven games and also games that were more gameplay driven as well.
Awesome. Yeah. And so today we wanted to talk about kind of the larger picture of story in games, like thinking how, as a writer, a lot of our listeners are aspiring writers of many genre, many media and genres, of course, too. But thinking if you're going into games, how should you be looking at story? What should you be thinking about? How does your writing translate? And then at the more broad level of like where Kevin can come in, like just appreciating story in games and what kind of games we've enjoyed and how we've liked the story and how it's evolved. Does that sound about right to you guys? Yeah,
I will say the thing that intrigues me is the sort of multifaceted angle of storytelling in gameplay, because it's different than what I do. I mean, it's different than what my experience is. And in many ways, it's like writing. To me, from as an outsider, it's like writing simultaneous stories. Like you're not just writing one story thread the way I would for a book or even a comic or something. It's more, multifaceted, like I said earlier.
So what do you mean by that? I want to go into that because that could lead into a bigger, broader topic.
Because, for example, I mean, in just kind of referencing our article that you found on all the different, the maps basically of how this all works out. To me, it seems like because there are so many branches and so many ways that the story can go, there's just more depth to it than what if I write a short story or a novel, it's fairly linear. Even if the storytelling itself isn't linear, I mean the process is fairly linear. But when I look at how games are written and designed, to me it seems like there's so many things to juggle at one time, so many alternate timelines to consider. Basically, if the hero goes left instead of right, you've got a whole other branch of the story to tell. So there's a lot of extra depth there.
Yeah, that makes sense, and that's definitely a fun aspect of writing is that you don't just go and explore one avenue and try to find out what you think the best is. Yeah. You'd explore a whole lot of different avenues, but there's also the kind of games, of course, that don't do that. There's the very broad, high level, like open world games. There's like, old Super Nintendo Zelda or Secret of Mana where they have their stories, but you're just running around like slashing up bad guys and then hearing the stories in between. Yeah. And there's the very, very linear stories that are just completely A to Z.
Yeah.
which I think there's definitely some great storytelling in, and maybe Stefan has some more input into kind of which ones of those you've appreciated over the years and what you think some of the great aspects of them are.
Sure. One thing I would say is that I feel like games with a lot of branching certainly have a lot of breadth, but they don't necessarily have a lot of character depth or story depth. If you're trying to maintain a lot of wide branches, it can become very difficult to get the depth in there, or at least very expensive. And there certainly have been some very expensive to produce games that have both been broadly branching and deep. But they're kind of rare because they're super expensive to make. Like a lot of times you'll find a game like a Telltale game that goes deep into character and story, but doesn't really branch very much, or a game that branches very extensively and the sort of depth of the story kind of shallows, becomes shallow in that's those branching areas, and then sort of pinches back into these moments of plot or character development that are sort of central, and then sort of branches out again and comes back. And that's, the article that Kevin is referring to, which we'll post a link to on the site, talks about these different types of graphs that you can have in terms of game story flow design. And, for me, in terms of game story, like there certainly are games that are heavily story driven, but there's also elements of story in all kinds of games, and character, the character story, the character development being one of the paramount, or probably the paramount element of storytelling that's totally and completely essential to games. And one example I give of how that applies even to the most shallow and storyless games is Pacman, which establishes Pacman as a character in, I think it's like 3 or 6 cutscenes that are very, very simple, like essentially like 3-line stories about Pac-Man and his quests to evade ghosts and eat pills and eat ghosts. And it's really got like no depth whatsoever, but it's enough to get the player invested in Pac-Man as a character, to the point where, Pac-Man is one of the largest selling, most profitable franchises in the world. And there's been multiple games, and there's been cartoons about the life of Pac-Man and his friends and so on. And all of that started from just a very simple character story that was just told in simple cut screens. Same thing with Angry Birds, right? There's now a feature film coming out for Angry Birds, which really just started off as character design and simple character differentiation between the personalities of the birds, the various birds and the pigs and so on. So even at a very basic level where the game seems to have essentially no story whatsoever, the most successful games generally tend to have at least good character development, have some character development, have a character foundation to build a franchise on.
Mm-hmm. And I wonder, like the UCLA program has a course on video game writing that I'm sure is awesome, and some of the teachers from there wrote on God of War and other games like that. And recently, the Writers Guild Foundation had a panel on video game writing, and some of the people from God of War spoke on that and other games. But so I really wonder, like writing those kind of games, is that pretty much just linear, I would think, right? You're just jumping in there, writing a story, and then filling in the blanks around it with the gameplay, or vice versa. The mechanics are all there, but you just have to fill in the story.
Well, I think it depends. First of all, it depends on how a particular studio works, but it also depends on how you look at what the game story is, right? So a lot of people will essentially look at it as there's the major plot moments that are inevitable that the gameplay leads to, and oftentimes those are told through cutscenes where you're doing a bunch of gameplay, you're shooting things and climbing ladders and whatever else, you achieve a bunch of goals, and then it dumps to a cutscene, or you talk to a character in a specified location who gives you some exposition or both, and that is sort of the main story flow that's leading to an inevitable ending in games that don't branch their ending. I mean, games that do branch their ending, like say KOTOR, there's a lot of different permutations of the ending, although there's also similarities there as well. So that main story arc is like writing any other story arc, right? You are going to figure out your major plot points. You're going to figure out what secondary characters that are involved in each of the sequences. You're going to figure out what the story development is in between, what the character development is, if there is any, which in a lot of video games for the main character there isn't, because that's the player and you're leaving them a lot of empty space to inject themselves into the main character. But you may have character development for all of the secondary characters in order to have, some character story going on. And that is sort of like your main story arc. Now, if you have a branching game, then you're doing that for a bunch of different branches, right? So you're, branching, it can be thought of as multilinear for games that branch at player decision points. In open world games, you're developing basically a bunch of like localized scenarios that maybe don't necessarily lead to a single conclusion. It depends on, is it the game completely open world, or is it open world but there is a story? And if you play through it, if you go to all of the locations, you piece together some final conclusion. That depends on what the design of that game is. But there's also, I think a lot of times, because game writing and game story are considered one-to-one, and there's this historical divide in the industry between game writers and level designers, people tend to forget that, you spend most of your time playing the game, and the level design is actually an important part of the storytelling and what you, the player, are doing as you go through the level. What special items you're finding, what other characters that you can talk to that you encounter in that level are. A very simple level design for a game that is not got a lot of depth, it might just be you go in and you shoot a bunch of things. Well, but even in shooting a bunch of things, you're theoretically trying to accomplish something if the game has any sort of a story whatsoever. So the you spend most of your time playing the game. So I like to think about either, if I am the level designer, how that interacts with the written story, or if not, working with the level designers and the overall designer and so on to try and make the gameplay and the cinematics and so on stitch together in a way that's interesting, so that the player really feels like they're playing a character in a story, as opposed to like, so I'm this sort of random person who runs around shooting things for points, and then every once in a while I watch a little movie, and then I go back to being a random person running around and shooting things for points. Like, I think that's when a game story really isn't working, when the player just kind of feels like, oh, there's some cinematics that are like, I get to watch a movie as a reward for doing random disconnected things. Mm-hmm. And when a game story is really working, when you're engaged in the gameplay, you feel like you are a character in a drama who is, fighting to save or destroy the galaxy and or princess and or dragon, and that you, as you're playing through the actual gameplay, feel really invested in how what you're doing relates to the unfolding story, and how the action is designed and backstopped with dialogue, who's talking in your ear, or what sidekicks you have, and so on, is a big part of that. Environmental storytelling can be a big part of that. The BioShock games being pretty stellar in terms of putting all of that together. You'd asked for examples earlier. I think that the BioShock games are kind of the pinnacle of weaving all of that together.
Mm-hmm. What about The Last of Us? I know everybody always talks about The Last of Us being such an amazing game. For me, I saw a lot of that awesomeness, like you're talking about the design, and it definitely flows in there, but I kind of got stalled on the mechanics after a while. Like, oh my god, I have to sneak by another zombie. I have to do the same exact kind of mechanic again and again. But what is it that works for most people? My criticism aside, and in these kind of games, is it, do you feel that it's really weaved into the story like you were talking about?
For me, I think that if it's weaved into the story, it's going to be most successful. You know, getting hung up on the mechanic, sometimes it's bad design, bad mechanic design, bad level flow, and so on. Sometimes it's just that the mechanic is not interesting to you, right? Like, I like shooting games, so if the mechanic is I get to shoot a bunch of things and they blow up, I'm pretty happy. I don't like stealth games, so if the mechanic is I have to sneak past a bunch of things that are going to bite, blow up, stab, or whatever me if I don't very slowly and methodically plod past them in some very clever way, like, I find that less enjoyable because I'm not really a big fan of stealth mechanics. Other people absolutely love stealth games and they think they're awesome. They really want to spend their time figuring out the ways to stealthily sneak through the levels and find clever ways to sneak around things and figure out, stealth puzzles and so on.
Yeah.
And that's great. Like, for those people, those games are the best. So it's also a matter of who you are as a player and what kind of games do you enjoy the most.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think Uncharted, I love those games, and there's very few moments where I feel like, but in Uncharted 2, there's this place where you're in this big room and you have to take down these kind of guards. And man, I just wanted to go in there and Shadow of Mordor them, Like, I just wanted to jump in there and slice off their heads and not worry about sneaking past.
So I have a question then. Like, how do you balance the sort of the need for the audience? Because you've got, on the one hand, you've got the game audience itself is being determined by, I don't know, by someone. The company, someone in the company has decided we're going to build a game for this audience. But sometimes game audience and story audience are different. So how do you balance that? Like, how do you develop the story and develop a protagonist who is, going to be influenced by the personality of the player? How do you work around all of that so that you're presenting a story that's engaging to the player, but also drives the game forward?
Well, one thing is, for games that are highly interactive outside of just the storytelling, so like things other than Telltale style games, particularly big AAA games, your protagonist is not going to be the character that carries the most weight in terms of exposition and change and so on in telling the story. A protagonist for a game where the player is really inserting themselves into that role is generally going to be a broad archetype.
Okay.
Right. Master Chief from Halo. What is Master Chief from Halo's deal? I don't know. Like, he's a Master Chief and he's a badass, and that's what you want to be. He doesn't have a lot of dialogue. He doesn't have a lot of depth. He's like a cool, super badass dude that you get to be. And you get to figure out who your Master Chief is by how you play and what goes on in your head when you are inhabiting the role of Master Chief and responding to everything that goes on around you. And it's all of the other characters in those kinds of games that are going to carry the story forward, and what happens to them is going to carry a lot of the story emotional weight. We're going to get you invested in this character and then kill them to make you sad, like that kind of thing. And the games that have more character story depth, and Telltale games do this in spades, are going to also have the non-player characters respond to you in different interesting ways depending on decisions that you make as a player. So then the kind of, character X, Master Chief or Lee or whoever, that you as a player, how you create that character through your decisions and your gameplay will influence non-player characters and make them respond to you in different ways. Like that's, I think, like the pinnacle of character story and interactivity coming together in a really satisfying way. And that's something that Telltale does a lot of, but other games have done it as well. The KOTOR alignment system has a whole kind of universe built around things changing depending on how you play, how good or evil you are, and so on.
So how do you...
Really, okay.
Go ahead, Justin.
Go ahead. No,
I asked the last one.
I was kind of changing topics, so I'll jump in there. We can
go
go
ahead.
back if
Let's
you want.
change topics then.
But like you were saying, Stephan, about the design playing such a big role. There's a lot of people who love the non-story parts of games and really feel like that's where the story comes from. When I was interviewing people for the first creative writing career book, I was talking to Joshua Rubin, and he was talking about Portal 2 and how like there's points where you kind of find a side room that felt like it wasn't supposed to be there, like you discovered it on your own, and it's saying stuff like "leave, it's all a lie," and little bits like that are are kind of outside of your typical thoughts of what a story would be and how a story in a game or anywhere would progress. And that's kind of an interesting topic for writers. Like I don't before coming into the game industry or talking to these people, I never thought of story in that sense of like what the environment is around you and how it affects you or how it might change based on what you've done. But just kind of throwing that out there, it's kind of a cool way to think about it.
Yeah, for sure. And that kind of environmental, open world, exploratory, etc. storytelling is definitely an important part of certain kinds of games, such as the kind of game that Portal is. And that isn't unprecedented in the world of writing outside of games either. And also it comes down to part of the problem is writers conflate writing with storytelling, right? Like, well, writing and storytelling are the same thing. There's no other way to tell stories except through writing. And of course that's not true. And so, designing a game level is kind of like the way that you tell a story if you're designing a theme park or a haunted house, or a experiential theater performance, like a lot of the dinner theaters in New York and LA, where you go in and you're put into an immersive world of whatever it would be, 1930s detectives or steampunks or whatever, and a interactive story unfolds around you that's kind of like a dinner LARP or LARPing in general. And so looking at and role-playing game design, and so the interactive storytelling has these elements of exploration and player control that change how you think about telling the story. And for a writer, it means kind of getting off of always being on that linear train and thinking about, well, okay, I've got my linear story, but then there's this whole world that the player can walk around in, and what's going to be interesting about that. Not only side quests, but how can you break up your linear story into interesting pieces that can be discovered, and how can you branch and pinch back if you want to have branching in your game, like thinking about issues like, okay, well, I inevitably want them to get to this particular story point, but maybe there's 2 or 3 different paths they can go through that aren't just literally different paths, like I walked left or right, but like what is interesting and different about going left or right in terms of what the player experiences and how that pushes the story forward, are all new things to think about for people who've been writing novels or screenplays where everything just steams through linearly, but might be less of a stretch for people who've been writing paper role-playing games or designing haunted houses or whatever.
Yeah, and I would also think that this is another concept that I haven't dealt with in my own writing, but the idea of writing multiplayer games, for example, Secret of Mana back in the day, Super Nintendo, you have three people who could all be playing together. You're in a living room, chopping up people and, or the bad guys, little cute mushrooms, whatever they were, and casting your spells and like, quick, heal me right now. And it becomes almost like your own little adventure. Like you're telling the story through the way that you're interacting with your friends as you're playing, because you're in the moment. You're, cast that magic spell on that guy right now, just as if you were in a game telling your NPC character to cast a magic spell. And I think I don't know if those people who developed that game, thought about that kind of story and how that's going to impact it. But I just felt as a player, that was a really big part of those games.
Yeah, I mean, you definitely have to think about that. And you also have to think about how you get out of the way of the player to let them have their own experience. In a game, you need as much story as you need, and you leave a lot of space for the player. Again, in certain kinds of games, I mean, the other issue being that right now we call everything that happens on a computer a game, right? Like a lot of people call interactive fiction games because that's just the thing that they call things that are on computers. And there's a whole spectrum of kinds of interactive storytelling, from interactive fiction to, games that are just 99.9% gameplay and just have a very thin layer of characterization and everything in between. So it's also a matter of figuring out what kind of interactive experience you're designing, working with the designer, if the writer is not the designer or the creative director is not the designer or whatever, that team working together to agree on what kind of experience you're creating, what the story is, how the story is going to be told, how much story is going to be expositional, how much is going to be experiential, and how much is going to be left open for the player to infer and create in their imaginations. And it's just, it's a different process. It's a different way of telling stories. It's a different level of story versus experience balance than, say, a novel or a screenplay. But I think it's the most foreign for novelists, because if you're a screenwriter who has ever been involved in the process of actually making a movie, a whole bunch of other hands come into production at that point, and you have all the visual storytelling elements and the audio storytelling elements and how things are going to be edited and so on. And so that collaborative aspect that you have with working with a designer and a creative director and production designer and so on is similar. But the non-linearity and the exploratory aspects of certain kinds of games and the very thin, how do you tell story in sort of tiny little snippets with a very thin layer that engages but leaves 90% room for gameplay. Those are all different problems to solve, but in the end what you're trying to do is have a human being connect with the story that you're trying to tell, and that means having characters that they can relate to doing things that seem fun or interesting or engaging.
Kind of like this
Kevin,
podcast.
did you have any more questions or thoughts, Kevin, that you want to throw in there before we kind of wrap this episode up?
There's just there's so much that I don't quite understand about storytelling in that format. But my closest experience to it is writing and directing like documentary pieces, because I have maybe 50 or 60 interviews sometimes. One of the projects I worked on, we had over 200 hours of interview footage alone, and you have all those points of view to work into a story, and then you have the B-roll of planes flying and military operations and things like that you have to work in. And so I guess that's the closest I can come to this idea of how to take all of that and gel it into one cohesive story, because there's so many different directions that could go. And I know that in that form of storytelling, it's important to find the through line for the whole narrative. And I'm guessing it's the same for gaming. That didn't really come out as a question.
Yeah, for sure.
But yeah, okay.
No, definitely. And also, I mean, gaming is a very, very broad topic. There are so many styles and genres of games. It's a half-hour podcast, so we will definitely come back to this topic again and again.
Yeah.
And I would definitely say if listeners have specific questions about story and game, specific game topics that they would like us to cover sooner rather than later, to definitely drop us a line and let us know. Like if you're absolutely dying for a in-depth exploration of how you do thin character development for Angry Birds type of games, or at the far other end, how you do extensive world building for a massive role-playing game, drop us a line and we'll think about it.
Yeah.
Cool. All right, guys. Well, let's wrap this one up and come back to another one in the near future.
Yeah, there you go.
All right,
Yes,
guys.
indeed.
Yeah. All right. This has been the Creative Writing Career Podcast. Thank you, all you listeners, for tuning in.
Thanks so much for listening to the Creative Writing Career Podcast with your hosts, Stephan Bugai, Justin Sloan, and Kevin Tumlinson. We'll catch you next time.